There is a moment that happens in almost every life, usually quietly, usually without witnesses, when a person realizes they have spent years performing for an audience that was never really watching. Not a stadium, not a crowd, just a parent, a partner, a boss, a friend, a stranger on a screen. And somewhere in that realization is a strange mixture of grief and relief. Grief, because of all the time spent shrinking, adjusting, editing yourself to be acceptable. Relief, because the moment you see it clearly, you can never fully unsee it again. This is a video about that moment, about the invisible architecture of approval seeking that most people build their entire identity on top of, without ever choosing to. About what happens in the mind and the body when you live your life trying to be liked, trying to be understood, trying to be validated by people who may never have the capacity to give you what you are asking for. And about what changes, slowly and then suddenly, when you stop. If you have ever felt exhausted after being around people, even people you love, if you have ever rehearsed a text message 11 times before sending it, if you have ever agreed to something you didn't want, smiled when you wanted to cry, apologized for things that weren't your fault, just to keep the peace, just to stay likable, just to avoid the discomfort of someone, somewhere, being disappointed in you, this is for you. Stay with this one. Not because it will entertain you, but because somewhere in the next 40 minutes you might recognize yourself. And that recognition is the beginning of something most people never get to experience: the return to their own authority. Let's start at the root. Approval seeking is not a character flaw. It is not weakness, and it is not vanity, no matter how often it gets mistaken for either. Approval seeking is a survival strategy. It was built brick by brick in the years when you had no power, no income, no ability to leave, no fully formed nervous system, and no choice but to adapt to the emotional climate of the people raising you. As children, we are not separate enough from our caregivers to evaluate them objectively. We don't get to think, this person is overwhelmed, inconsistent, critical, or emotionally unavailable, and that's about them. Instead, the child's mind does something much simpler and much more dangerous. It assumes the problem is them. If love feels conditional, the child doesn't conclude that love is being administered badly. The child concludes that they must not be enough as they are. That single, quiet conclusion, formed long before language could properly hold it, becomes the operating system underneath everything. And it doesn't go away just because you grew up, got a job, moved out, or became, by every outward measure, an adult. It goes underground. It becomes the voice that says, before you've even opened your mouth in a meeting, will this be okay? Will they like this? Am I too much, too little, too loud, too sensitive, too distant? It becomes the reflex that scans a room before you've even sat down, calculating who might be upset, who might be unimpressed, who might withdraw their warmth if you say the wrong thing. This is what Carl Jung pointed toward when he described what he called the persona. The persona is the mask. Not in a dishonest sense, not necessarily manipulative. Jung saw it as a necessary psychological structure, the face we present to the outer world so that we can function in society. We all need some version of a persona. You behave differently at a funeral than at a celebration. You speak differently to your boss than to your best friend. That flexibility is healthy. The danger Jung warned about is not having a persona. The danger is becoming so identified with the persona that you forget there is anything underneath it. He wrote about people who had so thoroughly fused with their social mask that they had, in his words, lost touch with their own depths. Imagine spending decades perfecting the art of being acceptable, likable, agreeable, easy to be around. And one day waking up and realizing you no longer know what you actually want, what you actually believe, what you would do if no one was watching, and no one would ever find out. That is the cost of a persona that has swallowed the self whole. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with a crisis, usually. It just slowly, quietly empties a person out from the inside, while the outside continues to function, continues to smile, continues to show up exactly the way everyone expects. This is the false self. Not false in the sense of being fake or evil, but false in the sense of being constructed for approval rather than grown from truth. The false self learns very early which parts of you are rewarded and which parts of you are punished, ignored, mocked, or met with withdrawal. And it adapts. If anger was punished in your home, you learn to perform calm even when you are furious. If sadness made the adults around you uncomfortable, you learn to perform fine even when you are breaking. If ambition was treated as arrogance, you learn to perform humility, even when you are starving for recognition. Bit by bit, the authentic responses go underground, and a new, curated self rises up to take their place, a self built entirely out of what keeps the people around you comfortable. Here is the cruel irony. The false self is built to be loved, but it can never actually receive love, because it isn't really you. When someone praises the mask, some quiet part of you knows, on a level that's hard to articulate, that they're praising a performance. The compliments don't land the way they should. The approval doesn't fill you up the way you hoped it would. So you go looking for more validation, more proof, more reassurance, because the last dose didn't actually nourish anything. It just touched the surface and slid right off. This is the hidden engine behind why approval-seeking never actually satisfies. You cannot fill a real hunger with an unreal offering. The self that is starving is the authentic one, the one hiding underneath, and the persona, no matter how well it performs, cannot eat on its behalf. I want you to sit with something for a moment. Not analytically, but honestly. Think about the last time you changed your opinion mid-sentence because you sensed disapproval forming on someone's face. Think about the last time you didn't say what you actually thought because you were scanning for the safest version of the truth. Think about how often your decisions, about your career, your relationships, your appearance, even your hobbies, have been shaped less by what you actually wanted and more by what would be acceptable, impressive, or at least not embarrassing to someone else. This isn't a confession booth. There's no shame in seeing this. Almost everyone is doing it, almost all the time, without realizing it. Because the approval-seeking machinery runs beneath conscious awareness. It was installed before you had the capacity to consent to it. If this is starting to feel uncomfortably familiar, that discomfort is worth staying with for a moment, rather than rushing past it. Insight like this tends to fade quickly if it isn't anchored somewhere. So before we go further, it might help to simply notice, without judging yourself, one place in your life right now where you are performing rather than living. Just notice it. We'll come back to it. Now let's talk about the cost. Because approval-seeking is not free. It has a price, and the price is paid in a currency most people don't track. Energy. Living for the approval of others requires constant, low-grade vigilance. You are perpetually monitoring tone, monitoring facial expressions, monitoring silences, monitoring the gap between what someone said and what they might actually mean. This kind of hypervigilance is exhausting in a way that doesn't always show up as obvious fatigue. It shows up as a strange, persistent depletion that no amount of sleep seems to fix. You can rest your body all weekend and still feel hollowed out, Because the thing that's tired isn't your body. It's the part of you that has been working overtime every single day, trying to manage everyone else's experience of you. This is what we might call the energy leak. Every time you suppress an honest reaction in favor of a palatable one, energy leaves the system. Every time you say yes when your body is screaming no, energy leaves the system. Every time you laugh at something that didn't strike you as funny, agree with an opinion you don't hold, or stay in a conversation 5 minutes longer than you wanted to because leaving might seem rude, energy leaves the system. None of these moments feel catastrophic on their own. That's exactly what makes them so dangerous. They're small enough to ignore, and there are enough of them, every single day, to quietly drain a person over the course of years. People often describe a kind of unexplained exhaustion that doctors can't quite locate, a tiredness that doesn't match their activity level. Of course, there can be many causes for fatigue, and real medical concerns should always be taken seriously. But for some people, what's actually happening is psychological. They are spending the majority of their waking hours managing an internal performance for an external audience, and the management itself is the thing draining them. The body keeps the score, as the saying goes, and a life built around appeasing others rather than expressing the self is a life that runs on a chronic energy deficit. And underneath the exhaustion there is something else. Shame. Shame is the emotional fuel of approval seeking, not guilt. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am something bad. Guilt can usually be repaired through an action, an apology, a correction, an amends. Shame can't be repaired through action because it isn't about action. It's about identity. And when shame is the operating belief underneath your personality, you don't just want people to forgive specific behaviors. You want them to confirm, again and again, that you are not fundamentally flawed. That's an impossible job to outsource to other people, because no amount of external reassurance can resolve an internal verdict. You can be told you're wonderful 1,000 times and still not believe it, if the shame underneath hasn't been addressed at its source. This is why approval seeking so often feels like an addiction. There's a hit of relief when someone responds warmly, when someone says yes, when someone seems pleased. And there's a crash when they don't, a crash that feels disproportionate to the actual stakes of the situation. Someone takes a few hours to text back, and the mind spirals into, what did I do wrong? A friend seems a little short on the phone, and the rest of the day is spent quietly replaying the conversation, looking for the offense. This isn't oversensitivity. This is a nervous system that learned, very early, that disapproval could mean danger, the withdrawal of love, of safety, of belonging, and it has never been told otherwise. Let's talk about people-pleasing specifically, because it deserves its own examination. People-pleasing gets romanticized as kindness, as generosity, as being a good person. And sometimes it overlaps with genuine kindness. But genuine kindness and people-pleasing are not the same thing, even though they can look identical from the outside. The difference is in the internal experience. Genuine kindness flows from abundance. You give because you have something to give, and giving feels expansive. People-pleasing flows from fear. You give because you're afraid of what will happen if you don't. Disapproval, conflict, abandonment, the label of being difficult or selfish. Genuine kindness can say no without guilt. People-pleasing cannot say no without an internal storm of anxiety. Here's the test that reveals the difference, and it's worth sitting with honestly. When you do something for someone, do you feel resentment afterward if they don't notice, thank you, or reciprocate? If the answer is yes, and for most people it sometimes is, that resentment is a signal. It means the giving wasn't entirely free. There was a hidden invoice attached to it, I did this for you. Now you owe me approval, gratitude, or affection in return. That invoice is rarely spoken aloud, sometimes not even consciously known, but it's there. And when it doesn't get paid, the resentment shows up as proof. This is what self-abandonment looks like in daily practice. Not one dramatic moment of betraying yourself, but thousands of small ones. Saying you're fine when you're not. Agreeing to plans you don't want. Laughing along with a joke that actually hurt. Staying quiet about a boundary being crossed because speaking up might create tension. Each of these moments is a tiny vote against your own legitimacy, a tiny message sent to your own nervous system that says, what you actually feel doesn't matter as much as keeping this other person comfortable. Do that enough times, for long enough, and you stop being able to easily access what you actually feel at all. The line between your authentic response and your performed response gets blurry, because the performed response has been running the show for so long. Boundaries are where this entire pattern gets tested in real time. A boundary is not a wall, and it's not a punishment. A boundary is simply an honest statement of what is and isn't acceptable to you, communicated clearly, and held even when someone reacts badly to it. For someone whose identity has been built on approval, boundaries feel almost physically dangerous, because a boundary, by definition, risks someone's disapproval. You are essentially saying, I would rather be honest than be liked in this moment. For a nervous system trained since childhood to prioritize being liked over being honest, that sentence can feel like standing at the edge of a cliff. This is exactly why so many people who consider themselves kind, generous, easygoing, low maintenance, find themselves quietly furious underneath the surface. Not because kindness itself causes resentment, but because boundaryless giving does. If you cannot say no, your yes means nothing, not even to yourself. And a life made up entirely of unboundaried yeses eventually curdles into a private, simmering bitterness that the person themselves often can't even explain. They look at their life and think, I do everything right. I'm good to everyone. Why do I feel so hollow, so resentful, so unseen? The answer, more often than not, is that they have spent years being agreeable instead of being known. There is a crucial distinction worth making here, one that Jung's work circles around again and again, even when he isn't using these exact words. The difference between being liked and being loved. Being liked is about the persona. It's about presenting a version of yourself that is easy, pleasant, impressive, agreeable, a version specifically engineered to generate positive social feedback. Being liked can be achieved by almost anyone, with enough effort, enough self-monitoring, enough willingness to suppress whatever might be inconvenient or unflattering. But being liked has a hidden flaw. It is conditional on the performance continuing. The moment you stop performing, the moment you express a real opinion, a real need, a real boundary, a real no, the liking can evaporate, because what was being liked was never actually you. It was the mask. Being loved is different. Being loved means being known, fully, including the parts that aren't impressive, aren't easy, aren't agreeable, and being held anyway. Being loved doesn't require performance, which is exactly why it feels so much more threatening to pursue. You can't control whether someone loves the real you, because you have to actually show them the real you first. And that means risking rejection of the thing you can't edit or improve, your actual self. Approval seeking is, underneath everything, a strategy to avoid that risk. It says, if I can just be likable enough, maybe I'll never have to find out whether the real me is lovable at all. This is the quiet tragedy at the center of a life organized around approval. In trying so hard to be loved, the approval seeker accidentally guarantees that they will mostly only ever be liked, because they never let anyone close enough to the real material to actually love it. The very strategy designed to protect against rejection ends up producing a deeper, more permanent kind of loneliness. The loneliness of being surrounded by people who adore a performance, while the person underneath the performance remains, in the most important sense, unknown and unseen. Let's pause here for a moment, because this is usually where something starts to shift for people listening to a message like this. Not because anything has been resolved yet, but because something has been named. If part of you has recognized itself in the last several minutes, you don't need to do anything about it right now. You don't need to fix it, decide anything, or have a breakthrough on command. Just let the recognition sit there. Awareness, on its own, before any action is taken, already starts to loosen the grip of a pattern that has been running unconsciously. If this is resonating, it might be worth continuing to listen with that same quality of attention, not analyzing yourself harshly, just noticing, the way you'd notice weather changing. Now, what does Jung actually offer as the way out of this? Because naming a problem isn't the same as solving it, and a video like this would be incomplete if it only diagnosed the wound without pointing toward the medicine. Jung's answer, in essence, was a lifelong process he called individuation. Individuation is the process of becoming who you actually are, as opposed to who you were conditioned to become. It is the slow, often uncomfortable work of separating your authentic self from the various masks, roles, and adaptations you built to survive your environment, your family, your culture, your early relationships. It is not about rejecting the persona entirely. Remember, the persona has its uses. It's about no longer mistaking the persona for the whole of who you are. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that got exiled because they weren't convenient, weren't approved of, weren't safe to express. Individuation requires confronting what Jung called the shadow, the parts of yourself that were deemed unacceptable and pushed out of conscious awareness. Anger that wasn't allowed, ambition that was called arrogant, sensitivity that was called weakness, sexuality that was shamed, need that was labeled as too much. These don't disappear just because they're suppressed. They go underground, into the shadow, and from there they leak out sideways, as passive aggression, as resentment, as self-sabotage, as sudden eruptions that seem disproportionate to whatever triggered them, as a strange compulsion to people-please right up until the moment you snap and overcorrect entirely. The work of individuation involves slowly, carefully, often with real difficulty, inviting those exiled parts back into the light. Not to act them out recklessly, but to acknowledge them, integrate them, and let them inform a fuller, more honest version of yourself. A person who has done some of this work doesn't stop having needs, doesn't stop feeling anger, doesn't stop wanting things for themselves, but they no longer have to perform the absence of these things in order to feel acceptable. The anger can be felt and channeled, rather than suppressed and leaked. The ambition can be owned and pursued, rather than disguised as modesty. The need can be spoken plainly, rather than hidden behind passive hints and hope. So what actually changes when a person begins to genuinely stop seeking approval, not perfectly, not overnight, but as an ongoing practice and orientation? The first thing that changes is the texture of your decisions. When approval is no longer the primary filter, choices start to come from a different place. You start asking, what do I actually want here? Instead of, what would be most acceptable here? This sounds simple, but it reorganizes almost everything. Your career path, who you spend time with, how you spend your weekends, what you say yes and no to. Many people discover, somewhat uncomfortably, that they don't actually know the answer to "what do I want?" at first, because that question has been dormant for so long, buried under decades of "what is wanted of me?" That's normal. The muscle has atrophied from disuse, not disappeared. It comes back with practice. The second thing that changes is your relationship to disapproval itself. This doesn't mean you become immune to it. That would be inhuman and frankly undesirable, since some sensitivity to others is part of being a decent, connected person. What changes is the intensity of the reaction. Disapproval stops feeling like an emergency. It stops triggering the full nervous system alarm of, "I am in danger of losing love and belonging." It starts to register more like weather, sometimes pleasant, sometimes not, but not a verdict on your worth. Someone can disagree with you, dislike a decision you made, even be disappointed in you, and you can hold that discomfort without collapsing into it, or immediately trying to fix it by abandoning your position. The third thing that changes is your energy. Remember the energy leak we talked about earlier? All those tiny suppressions, performances, and self-betrayals that drain a person daily. When you stop seeking approval as compulsively, that leak begins to close. You stop spending hours replaying conversations, wondering if you said the right thing. You stop pre-managing other people's emotional reactions before you've even spoken. The energy that used to go into monitoring, performing, and managing starts becoming available again for creativity, for genuine connection, for rest that actually restores you, for pursuing things that matter to you rather than things that look good to others. The fourth thing that changes, and this one tends to surprise people, is your relationships. This is worth slowing down on because it isn't intuitive. Many people fear that if they stop being so agreeable, so accommodating, so eager to please, they will lose people. And it's true, some relationships do change, or end, when a person stops performing the role they used to play. But here's what actually tends to happen. The relationships that were only ever sustained by your performance start to fade, because there was never much real connection there to begin with, just an exchange of mutual convenience. And the relationships that were real, the ones with people who actually wanted to know you, rather than just be comfortable around you, often deepen. Because for the first time, the other person is getting access to something true, rather than something curated. People can feel the difference between being around someone who is performing ease and someone who is genuinely at ease, even if they can't articulate why one feels more nourishing than the other. This is, in a way, the test that separates being liked from being loved that we talked about earlier. When you stop seeking approval, you find out, often for the first time in your adult life, who actually loves you. Not the mask, but you. It can be a frightening test to take because there's a real chance that some people fail it. But it's also the only way to ever actually know, instead of perpetually wondering, underneath the surface of every relationship, whether you'd still be wanted if they really saw you. I want to bring you back for a moment to that thing I asked you to notice earlier. The place in your life right now where you've been performing rather than living. Maybe it's a relationship where you've been agreeing with things you don't believe. Maybe it's a job where you've been shrinking your actual capability to avoid seeming threatening. Maybe it's a family dynamic where you've been playing peacekeeper at the cost of your own honesty. Whatever it is, I'm not asking you to fix it right now. I'm only asking you to let it be visible. Visibility is the first act of individuation. You cannot reclaim what you refuse to see. It's also worth saying clearly, this is not about becoming cold, withholding, or indifferent to other people. That would simply be trading one extreme for another, swapping a fear-based compliance for a fear-based defensiveness, which is really just approval-seeking in reverse, still organized around other people's reactions, just trying to provoke a different one. The goal of individuation isn't to stop caring what others think. It's to stop needing their approval in order to know who you are. There's a profound difference between those two things. You can care about someone's feelings, take them seriously, even adjust your behavior out of genuine respect and love, without that care being the foundation your entire identity rests on. The foundation has to come from somewhere else. It has to come from you. This is, I think, the most important reframe in this entire video, so let me say it plainly. Approval seeking is not really about other people. It's about using other people as a mirror to determine your own worth, because somewhere along the way, you lost direct access to that determination yourself. The work isn't to convince other people to give you a better reflection. The work is to stop needing the mirror at all, to develop an internal sense of worth that doesn't fluctuate based on who is or isn't pleased with you on any given day. This is hard. I'm not going to pretend it's a simple switch you flip. It's a practice, often a lifelong one, and it tends to move in spirals rather than straight lines. You make progress, then you catch yourself slipping back into old patterns under stress. Then you notice that more quickly than you used to. Then you make progress again, a little further out than before. That spiral is not failure. That spiral is the actual shape of individuation. Jung never described this process as arriving at some final, fixed, fully individuated identity. He described it as an ongoing relationship with yourself, one that deepens, but never fully completes, because the self is not a static thing to be achieved once and checked off. It is something you keep meeting, again and again, in new contexts, at new depths. If you've made it this far into this video, something in you is already participating in that process, whether you fully realize it or not. The fact that you're still here, still listening, still willing to look honestly at these patterns instead of turning away from the discomfort, says something about where you actually are. Closer to your own truth than the part of you still scared of disapproval would have you believe. Let this be one of those quiet moments that you remember later, not because anything dramatic happened, but because something in you recognized itself, maybe for the first time in a long while. Let's talk practically for a moment about what this actually looks like day to day, because insight without practice tends to evaporate. The first practice is simple, even if it isn't easy. The pause. Before agreeing to something, before answering a question about your preferences, before responding to a request, build in a small pause, even just a breath, and ask yourself honestly, is this a yes because I want it, or a yes because I'm afraid of what will happen if I say no? You won't always have the courage to act on the honest answer right away. That's fine. The pause itself, repeated enough times, starts to rebuild the connection between your actions and your actual internal state, a connection that approval-seeking slowly severs. The second practice is tolerating the discomfort of disappointing someone, in small, low-stakes situations, on purpose. Not cruelly, not carelessly, just honestly. Saying you'd rather not, when that's true. Expressing a preference that's different from the group's. Letting a silence sit instead of rushing to fill it with reassurance. These small reps build the same kind of capacity that physical exercise builds in the body, except here, what's being strengthened is your tolerance for someone else's temporary displeasure, without your nervous system treating it as catastrophic. The third practice is learning to self-validate before seeking outside validation. After completing something, a piece of work, a hard conversation, a decision, pause before checking how others reacted and ask yourself first, do I think I did well here? What do I actually think about this? This reorders the sequence. Most approval seekers go straight to the external read before they've even formed an internal opinion, which means the external opinion gets to write the story uncontested. Forming your own assessment first, even imperfectly, starts to restore your authority as the primary judge of your own life. The fourth practice, and perhaps the deepest one, is befriending the parts of yourself you've spent years hiding. This is shadow work in its most practical form. It might mean journaling honestly about the anger you've never let yourself feel toward a parent. It might mean admitting, even just to yourself, the ambition you've been calling just a hobby because wanting it openly felt too exposing. It might mean acknowledging a need for affection, attention, or rest that you've labeled as weakness or selfishness. These exiled parts are not your enemies. They're orphaned pieces of you, waiting, sometimes for decades, to be let back in. Individuation isn't about becoming someone new. It's about becoming whole, which usually means becoming more, not less, of who you already secretly are. As you build these practices, something starts to happen that's hard to describe until you've experienced it. You begin to develop what might be called an internal home. A steady, quiet place inside yourself that doesn't move much, regardless of who's pleased or displeased with you on a given day. This internal home is not arrogance, and it's not indifference. It's stability. It's the felt sense that your worth isn't up for a vote. People can disagree with you, criticize you, even walk away from you, and the home remains standing because it was never built on their approval in the first place. It was built on your own honest relationship with yourself. This is, I think, the deepest meaning behind Jung's phrase, often quoted but rarely understood in its full weight, that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Notice the word privilege. Not obligation, not burden, privilege. Because most people never even attempt it. Most people live and die inside the persona, having spent an entire life optimizing for the approval of others, never once asking what they themselves actually wanted, actually believed, actually were, underneath all that careful management. To even begin this process, to even sit here right now considering it seriously, is already a kind of quiet rebellion against that default, and a kind of homecoming. I want to leave you with one more idea before we close, because I think it reframes everything we've talked about in a way that might stay with you longer than any single insight on its own. The opposite of approval seeking is not arrogance, and it's not isolation. The opposite of approval seeking is presence, the ability to be fully, honestly yourself in a room, without performing, without managing, without calculating the safest version of you to offer. Presence doesn't need approval, because presence isn't asking a question. It's not asking, "Do you like me? Do you accept me? Am I okay?" It's simply offering itself, as it is, and letting whatever happens, happen. That kind of presence is rare. It's magnetic, not because it's trying to be impressive, but precisely because it isn't trying at all. People can feel the difference, even if they couldn't explain it if you ask them. That is what's actually on the other side of this work. Not coldness, not isolation, not becoming someone who doesn't care about anyone. The other side is presence, a kind of quiet, grounded aliveness that doesn't require anyone else's permission to exist. It is, in the end, the return to the self that was always there, underneath the performance, waiting patiently to be lived from again. If something in this video has shifted something in you, even something small, even something you can't fully name yet, let that be enough for today. You don't need to overhaul your entire life by tomorrow morning. You don't need to confront everyone who's ever made you feel like you had to earn your worth. Individuation is slow, and it is yours, and it unfolds on its own timeline. What matters is that you've started paying attention, that you've started questioning the old reflex to perform instead of live, and that you've let yourself, even briefly, Imagine what it might feel like to no longer need anyone's approval to know that you are enough. If this resonated with you, consider staying a little longer with this channel, where we go deeper into these same questions: the self, the shadow, the long road back to who you actually are, beneath everything you were taught to become. There is more here when you're ready for it. Until then, take this with you. You were never actually too much, or too little, or too difficult to love. You were simply, for a long time, looking for permission from people who were never going to be able to give it, because the permission was never theirs to give in the first place. It was always yours. It still is.